You know, we've all been mates for quite a long time, so we don't get on each other's nerves as much as we could. We're quite friendly.
Yeah, so I see.
I'm not one to make a big documentary style of video on the Beatles. They truly have their own little endless world of pop culture onto themselves, where there's just so much to read and write about. I just want to talk about them for a second. I did that thing, where you grew up listening to them, then you just kind of end up getting out of it for a few years as other stuff interests you more. And then somehow, eventually, it ends up calling you back. For me, weirdly enough, it was Beatles for Sale of all the albums that got me back into the Beatles. Most of the time as a youngster that I spent listening to the Beatles were on these CDs that my uncle had, and we had most of them, but we never had Beatles for Sale. I had heard 8 Days a Week to death off the #1 compilation, and I'd hear other songs from time to time. But thankfully, I was a child born after the 90s, so internet. I understood that the computer could show me Beatles for Sale. And I was always drawn to No Reply, I'm a Loser, and Babies in Black, which is funny because those are the first 3 songs on the album anyway. I think I was so into those 3 specifically because they have a slightly different tone than the rest of the early Beatles stuff while still being just as catchy. It was nice getting back into that world with an album that wasn't completely burned into my memory. I remember distinctly listening to All Follow the Sun, which is a song I liked as a kid, but I never really paid it too much mind. But then listening to it again as a 16-year-old and hearing that part where John and Paul's harmonies are just melding seamlessly with that delicate backing track, and it was just a moment where I was like, damn, those guys really were that good, huh? And then I was finding so much enjoyment in all the little stuff that had never really struck me as a kid. Stuff like John absolutely belting it on the intro of Mr. Moonlight. And you got stuff like Ringo cheering George's solo on Honey Don't, and just discovering that I Don't Want to Spoil the Party is one of the best deep tracks in their discography. And now that I've hyped up Beatles for Sale for a second, I want to draw attention to the fact that it is widely considered to be their worst, or at least their weakest album, which is even funnier to me because I would agree that it is on the lower end of their albums, and I still think it's a pretty amazing album that's highly re-listenable. I don't think there's a more rewarding discography to sit down and pay attention to than the Beatles, not only because they don't have a bad album, but also in how you get to see these little kernels of bigger ideas sprinkled throughout their earlier work that grow more noticeable as you go on. The main appeal of the band really is the auditory and creative chemistry between the 4 Bugs and also their producer George Martin, which begins as the 4 being a tight unit where their strengths as musicians and vocalists just kind of meld into this satisfying flow of music that transcends musical sensibilities of this time that's passed. Like, look at their first album, Please Please Me. Track for track, it is not a 10 out of 10 album, but the energy on it is so timeless and infectious. George Martin got these 4 dudes fresh out of the clubs and cleaned up their raw sound and facilitated a more measured environment to flesh out their style, and this was largely done over the course of a single 12-hour session. Half of the album is covers, which was the style at the time. In fact, even my favorite song on it is a cover, and that's Anna, Go to Him. And on that song, the star of the show is unquestionably John Lennon's vocals. He gives the song a certain gravity, being tender and frustrated and vulnerable and desperate, and he's backed up by Paul and George doing the band's signature harmonies, and it truly all makes the track their own. That's the magic of this album specifically. It's all very straightforward. The shiniest bell or whistle you get is George Martin overdubbing a fancy little piano on Misery. Back to John Lennon for a second, he really did feel like the leader of the band on these early albums, just because his vocal mannerisms and presence was already so well defined and so heavy from the get-go. His voice is penetrating in a way that lends so much gravity to whatever he's singing. He really sinks his teeth into anything thrown his way, and he has this way of tensely softening and drawing out his voice, and it's a sound I cannot get enough of. There's a song on their second album with the Beatles called Not a Second Time, and the instrumental has like this heaviness to it with that piano beating down, and Lennon leans into that so heavily, and it's just so fucking good. Even from these earlier recordings, it's so easy to see how John Lennon grew so much mystique and power as an icon. And then Paul McCartney creatively really is the other side of that same coin, which became even more apparent as their songs grew more complicated and ambitious. He always came up with this sort of boyish confidence on these first two albums, like he doesn't have the gravity of Lennon yet, but there's a brightening quality to hearing his voice. And he hits his mark every time! All My Loving is one of the best tracks in their whole discography, and no one could have given that song the life it has other than Paul McCartney. George Harrison is a fascinating third element in the band because he was the lead guitarist, and early on, he mostly sang what Lennon and McCartney gave him, and the songs he did write just kind of was him doing their style of songs, but with his own personality to it. And one of the best things about the Beatles is seeing how George Harrison specifically grew into his own artist. Ringo Starr is the best drummer the band could have had, and we love him.
Ladies and gentlemen, here are four of the nicest youngsters we've ever had on our stage. The Beatles, bring them on!
Beatlemania is a huge and fascinating topic. I love listening to the Hollywood Bowl live album, which has performances from 1964 and 1965, and the screams of the crowd are so loud, it gives you the sense of what it would be like if the Beatles performed to a tortured audience in hell. A Hard Day's Night is the Beatlemania album, and it's perfect. It's so tightly crafted, every song is catchy and has something to make it memorable. This is the early 60s pop and rock sound perfected. And George and Ringo's contributions to this album are absolutely essential. It really is a Lennon and McCartney-centric album. Ringo doesn't even get a song to sing, and the one that George Harrison sings was written by John and Paul. In fact, every song was written by those two. There's not a single cover included. And here you don't really feel that divide between Lennon songs and McCartney songs. This is them working as a tight songwriting machine. If I had to choose just one favorite song, it would be Things We Said Today, which is sung by Paul McCartney. Paul has described the song as being about a sort of future nostalgia, not the Dua Lipa album, but this sort of melancholy you feel knowing one day you'll be nostalgically looking back on the current moment. It's their most mature song up to that point, and I love Paul McCartney's relaxed yet somewhat somber vocals and the way the guitar strums like They started to embrace more folk elements on Beatles for Sale and Help. And Help in general is just very underappreciated for how much they grew on that album. And the movie that goes along with it is just absolutely bonkers. It all kind of marked the expanding of their horizons. Bob Dylan, Weed, stuff like this is totally different from their initial well of influences, and they themselves were growing up and maturing and heading into their own directions. And they brought all of that back into the studio with them. The rapid speed they grew as artists once they decided to stop touring and become a studio band is absolutely ridiculous. Listening to Rubber Soul casually, and then actually paying attention to it is like two totally different experiences. It goes down easy like their earlier stuff, but when you pay attention, every song is just so much more complicated. They're noticeably more dynamic and densely composed while maintaining the initial appeal of their music. And that's something I think is so cool. The further any artist in any medium goes into their ambitions and their own personality, taking their sensibilities into uncharted territories, it often gets more obscure and so specific that it sheds the universal appeal that their other stuff might have had. And that's something I absolutely love. I appreciate it so much when artists in any medium do that. But the Beatles specifically managed to push their craft so far and so quickly, and it's all immediately accessible and connected to what was initially appealing about them. They really were like cultural and artistic sponges at this middle period, where all their new discoveries and fascinations were wrung out into their music. Revolver is this beautifully made collision point where the psychedelia and desire to push boundaries blend seamlessly with their commercial prowess. Every song has so much personality that you can lose yourself in any of them. And the album flies by because they're all so listenable and catchy. The drums and the bass and the guitars, they all sound so distinct and recognizable on this record. And there are so many cool little compositional choices made. Like, I'm sorry, the little reversing guitar that sometimes appears on this album is just always going to be incredibly satisfying to hear. There's such an apparent air that the world is bigger and they want to tell you about it. In 3 back-to-back tracks, you get lines like, lives in a dream, waits at the window wearing a face she keeps in the jar by the door. Who is it for? Everyone seems to think I'm lazy. I don't mind, I think they're crazy. Running everywhere at such a speed, till they find there's no need. There's people standing ground, who'll screw you in the ground. They'll fill you in with all their sins, you'll see. when I was getting back into the Beatles, I remember looking at the track list for Sgt. Pepper's and thinking, wow, this is kind of weaker than the other ones. Because I loved and enjoyed most of these songs, but individually, I just didn't have the appreciation for them that I had for some of their other albums. So for a little while, I wasn't really playing Peppers that much. There were still songs that were in my regular rotation, like Lovely Rita and A Day in the Life, which I think A Day in the Life is probably the best song ever recorded, but that's neither here nor there. But one day, I had a lot of mowing to do. You know, like grass. And I needed music, so I threw on Sgt. Pepper's to listen to the whole album in order for the first time in all those years. And even though I was sweaty and covered in gnats, it clicked. The colorfully eclectic psychedelia of the album really pops hearing everything in the intended sequence, and I have such a hard time putting what exactly that is into words. As a wise man once said, it just works. So many times since that day, I've just thrown this album on casually to hear the first couple of tracks and then ended up hearing the little final boom on A Day in the Life, like what felt like 5 minutes later. Magical Mystery Tour kept pushing that sound from Peppers, injecting it with more character and off-kilter tracks like the surreal word salad nonsense of Lennon's I Am the Walrus, or the hazy and unnerving energy of Harrison's Blue Jay Way. I really do think in some ways that the Beatles were at their peak in 1966 and 1967. Between Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour, Paul McCartney's ambition to build these sweeping projects like Peppers, John Lennon's ability to push Paul's ideas further and compete with them, George Harrison has come into his own and is writing songs you wouldn't get from John and Paul, and he's turned into a one-of-a-kind guitarist. And Ringo Starr is like this perfect glue, drumming along perfectly to any idea thrown at him. Though they grew divided, they just kept getting better. They all wanted to do their own ideas in their own way, and when that happens, you get the White Album. A double album where they throw everything at the wall, and every member's personality is so loud, it's so eclectic, chaotic, and unpredictable. I have heard this album so many times, and it can still catch me off guard. It's just pure creativity from 4 people who work together so well, but want totally different things. And I just get this surge of excitement when I hear it. All 4 of them are all doing different things within their own different things on this album. You can get everything from a super sweet, straightforward tune like Obla Di Obla Da to an abstract, unnerving 10-minute sound collage under the same project. And you just don't get any cooler than that. It's really their work ethic that makes this last leg of the Beatles' discography so good. Their last 2 albums are simply beautiful. Abbey Road is considered among the greatest of all time, and I don't need to tell you that the Abbey Road medley is a masterpiece. Everyone thank Paul McCartney for that one. Let It Be is a really messy album that also somehow includes some of the most beautiful songs ever written. I'm so grateful for the Get Back documentary for just letting us see these 4 work for hours on end. Even though it was filmed when tensions were skyrocketing, their friendship is still so palpable, and the desire to make something interesting and worthwhile still so strong. I've Got a Feeling is a song that I largely ignored before this documentary. You see them rehearse it so many times as the song is coming together as mostly just this jamming rocker, but when it hits that point where it's working and John and Paul are trading verses, and the image of the 4 of them playing together becomes so vivid. Their relationships were complicated, but it all came from passion and love for their craft and each other.
The inevitable question.
Are they ever going to get back together?
Yeah.
You see, it's strange, because at one period when they're asking me, I was saying, no, never, what the hell, go back, no, not me. And then there came to a period when I thought, well, why not, if we felt like making a record or doing something. And the other question is, would it be worth it? But that is answered by if we wanted to do it. If we wanted to do it, then it'd be worth it. If we got in the studio together and thought we turn each other on again, then it would be worth it, And sod the critics, they've got nothing to do with it. The music is the music. If we make a piece that we think was worthwhile, it goes out. But it's such a, it's pie in the sky,
The reunion tracks from the 90s, Free as a Bird and Real Love, get criticism largely for Jeff Lynne's production, which is just kind of whatever to me. But just the intent of the 3 of them coming together to finish some of John's final demos is really sweet. Free as a Bird captures a feeling of having lost something, knowing it's flown away so beautifully. But Real Love, specifically, in my opinion, is as good as any classic Beatles tune. And when I'm talking about Real Love, I am specifically talking about the Anthology 2 mix, and not as much the 2015 mix that's on the music video. It's one of John's most haunting and disarming melodies, with simply effective lyrics. The harmonies are out of this world and breathe so much magic into the track, and George lays down some of his finest and emotionally charged guitar playing to my ears. For a long time, this was the final Beatles song, and hearing John's opening lines of "all my little plans and schemes, lost like some forgotten dreams," it just hits, you know? Then it was the last Beatles song, but now and then is the last Beatles song. And yeah, I love it. I got addicted to listening to John Lennon's demo of this song about a year before the Beatles version came out. And it was just so amazing to hear it be completed. Like, the moment when they were teasing the tracks, and it was some teaser video that they released, and it's a camera pushing in on, like, a little audio station. And for the first time ever, they played the cleaned up and separated vocal track for John Lennon. And hearing that for the first time is something that will always stick with me.
It's all because of you.
It's just so sweet and really awe-inspiring that all these years later, Paul McCartney at, 82 or 83? He is still honoring John's legacy and honoring George with that beautiful slide guitar solo inspired by his style. Part of me feels bad about not doing a more insightful, detailed video where I really dig into the substance of the Beatles. But gosh darn it, I just wanted to relax and just kind of like glide through the Beatles history a little bit, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'm kind of directing this video more to people who aren't as familiar with it, because if you're very steeped in Beatles stuff, then this video will probably do nothing for you, unless you're like me and just like hearing people talk about it from time to time. But I hope it spurred you on to check out their music, or at least dig deeper into their music. I can probably do like 2 or 3 more videos in this style just about the Beatles, and who knows, I might one day. But I'm going to leave it here for now. I usually make videos about movies, and I try to make movies sometimes. But I want to do occasional videos like this about any old topic. So if that sounds interesting to you, if you like this video, stick around, subscribe. I'm going to have a lot more stuff cooked up. I have been cooking. Like not so much like a chef, more like someone who broke into a McDonald's with hamburger meat they stole from Food Lion. So y'all take care.